right, we're going to have our second look at Perelandra, or Voyage to Venus. And I left off last time trying to introduce the perspective that Lewis tries to take on the novel as a whole. His attempt to introduce us into a spiritual landscape, which he was hesitant to do in the first installment. And I suggested to you that the reason for that is that it would not have been persuasive from a, let's say, an apologetic standpoint. You want to bring people along with you, and there are certain, there's an order in which you need to address things in order to, so that they follow you. And if you immediately introduce theological hypotheses at the front end where they have objections before that, they're not going to buy it and just say, you're asking me to believe in fairy stories, effectively. So I have certain rational objections. And so in the first installment, Out of the Silent Planet, he really dealt with the problem of science as a sort of religion, which is basically the form of one of the many forms of atheism. And when we think of atheism, we tend to see it as in very, a unified thing. It's just an objection to theism or a hostility to it. But there is a book out recently by a man named Gray, 7 Types of Atheism. I bought it a few days ago, and it's quite good. The 3rd chapter talks about science as religion as a type of atheism, and I think that's what we're confronting. Lewis is talking about in The Abolition of Man, but also here in the sci-fi trilogy. And he mentions in 1899 there is a German biologist by the name of Ernst Haeckel, Haeckel, publishes a book called The Riddle of the Universe. And Haeckel is really hostile towards monotheism in general, not just Christianity, but any idea of God being the creator. And he presents a new religion of science. He calls it monism, or monism, M-O-N-I-S-M, so a unifying view. Lewis, in his Mere Christianity, would probably identify it with with pantheism as well. So he posits God and he puts it in everything rather than a God. God is, everything is God, effectively. And he uses a mode of inquiry to replace God. So the method is effectively replacing God. And that includes a scientific anthropology in Haeckel's place. And he, interestingly, you'll find this interesting, divides humanity into a hierarchy of racial groups with white Europeans at the top. We find that interesting because this is the thing that in our day is associated with colonialism and furthermore with Christianity as such, when actually the atheist Gray rightly attributes this to a certain atheist scientific view of humanity, which is opposed to Christianity. And this is very common in the intellectual circles of the day. Julian Huxley, who is the founder of the Humanist Society, grandson of Thomas Huxley, by the way, Darwin's bulldog, published a paper in 1931 describing the Negro as a primitive form of Homo sapiens, and it distinguishes the 3 different groups: the Negroes, Caucasoids, Mongoloids, Negroids. 3 different types of groups. When I was at University of Western Ontario back in late 1980s, there was a psychologist by the name of Philippe Rushton who propounded something like a similar theory. Not that he propounded the theory, he did studies that compared the 3 groups and basically verified what was being maintained here by Julian Huxley. He said he did it without prejudice. He didn't have an agenda per se, but this is what he found. And so he compared IQ and everything from sprint speed, height, strength, all those things across the board. And but the three groups, very interesting. And by the way, he was absolutely hunted at Western for this. It was quite extraordinary. I saw him being chased around campus by groups. I mean, I thought his views were repugnant myself, but it was quite extraordinary to see that in person. But anyway, the rationalists of the day, and this is apropos of a lot of topics I've been talking about in this class and actually in my first year course as well, just not intentionally, but because I'm teaching a modest proposal and such things, which is proposing to eat babies, and I pushed it into the direction of currently medical assistance in dying, eugenics legislation and so forth. They believe that eugenics was a means of eradicating the inferior humans from the human family. That was its explicit intention, to propose basically to help the evolutionary process along. Right? Because, of course, the most evolved peoples, namely the white Europeans, were able to participate in the whole process. And then they went about and did that. And they were quite open about it. Now, these are British academics, they're American academics. When the Nazis come into power and start putting this into practice, suddenly everybody's horrified, as if, I mean, it's sort of like Frankenstein and you create the monster. You create the monster, they see the monster, and then they run away. I've got nothing to do with that monster, that's not me. So I have some sympathy for the hostility towards colonialism, but I think it's entirely misplaced. I think it's related to a certain scientific, atheistic elite. It's their doctrine, and it was applied, yes, in North America, and yes, in Europe, and yes, it influenced the scientific procedure, not just in Nazi Germany, but here as well. But the thing that I object to is that it's in any way associated with Christianity, since these people are implacably anti-Christian. And their view of human nature is materialistic in origin. It doesn't regard human beings as bearing the Imago Dei either. Christians can get duped and sucked into that agenda by other means. But it is no doubt here. And at any rate, this idea of hierarchies, it goes back all the way to the Enlightenment. And Lewis is interested in that, and in the first installment out of The Silent Planet, he actually, remember, H.G. Wells presented it as the way in which this cosmic grand lunar ordered his society. They actually bred people for certain tasks, because otherwise you're going to have to eradicate some. What's the scientific way forward to do it? Well, to make them fit for purpose. And Aldous Huxley in Brave New World proposes that's the way of the future as well. You're going to breed the alphas, the betas, the gammas, the deltas, etc. Before they're born even. You will hatch them so that they do things and they're useful, so they don't end up with a surplus population of useless people. Horrifying. That's the first novel is written against that backdrop, and he tries to present on the other planet how different beings, rational in nature, can actually get along with each other, and they're not conditioned to be that way, that it's just the way they are. So they appear different, and they actually like different things, but there's no determining elite that makes them like that. So he's speaking back against Huxley, and he's speaking against eugenics implicitly. The explicit comes in the later novels, and in the second of the novels, that is Perelandra, he talks about what lies behind this, and that is there is a spiritual battle going on. If you introduce that in the first one, you would immediately, if you were a Christian, you might read it. If you weren't, you were going to reject it out of hand. So having addressed the scientific theories and shown an alternative way of looking at it, he now comes to the crux of the matter, which is that we have been ignoring the fact that there are spiritual powers at work in the midst of a material world. And they are involved even in our rationalizing of things. When we think we are being following pure reason as the Enlightenment did, we are nonetheless involved in a spiritual war. And the dark powers can use your reason and distract it and push it in the wrong direction just as well as the good powers can push it in the right direction. So pure reason, divorced of theological revelation, is not sufficient to avoid murder. And that, to me, that's what atheistic humanism demonstrates. That's what Nazi Germany demonstrates. That's what the eugenics movement, the abortion, the medical assistance in dying does. It shows that people who are highly rational can nonetheless make horrid ethical decisions, inhumane ones. So it's almost a proof. It is a proof of sorts. So that's where he introduces it, and I said that at the beginning of this book, Lewis is with Ransom, and he is narrating on behalf of Ransom. Lewis is the narrator here. But now he comes out from the first book, he just appears at the end. Now he is with him, and he's trying to explain what Ransom has told him, but he is a little bit hesitant, and he questions, he acts as if he were not the devil's advocate, that's the wrong phrase here, but he's skeptical about what he hears. Ransom says this, and Lewis is not quite with him yet on this. I'm not yet persuaded. I'm going to act like Jack Lewis before his conversion and pose the questions that I know somebody who isn't a Christian is going to have about these objections, as if I still had them, even though Lewis is the one writing here. So Lewis, the character, represents the old C.S. Lewis in the story, as it were. And what he depicts, as I say, is a form of spiritual warfare. And so he holds that decisions do not come through pure reason, but are influenced by spiritual forces, for good and for ill. Hence the need to pray. Hence the need for obedience. And he's going to emphasize that very strongly in this book. Ransom will need to obey even when it doesn't make sense to him. When he knows something's right and wrong, even though it doesn't make sense to him rationally, because he assumes that spiritual battles can't be physical, he will still be willing to undertake a physical battle. And he'll be thinking, I'm assuming that the conditions of earth are applying here, but it's quite clear to me he has a feeling that this is wrong, and a feeling that he ought to do this. And that sense of listening to God, who is not communicating to him. Remember, God is the God he described in that I described at any rate in the last battle as the Deus absconditus, the hidden God. God is there, and yet there's no sense that he is there. In fact, it seems like he's not there. Everything's coming to him. Remember I said that, if you were with me last semester, it's the last king of Narnia, and he's crying out for help, and help doesn't come. There is no answer. Or when there is an answer, and the who is it that drops in there on them? Eustace and what's her name? Jill Pole, and they drop in there to help, and they are of no help. Like they're always the kids are always the solution to the problem, right? But here they end up being helpless, because it is the last battle, it is the end. There is no way of pushing back the darkness any longer. The darkness is about to conquer, and all seems lost. And where is God in the midst of all this? Well, it happens in a totally unexpected way. But there is a palpable sense of darkness in that novel. It's a very dark novel. And interestingly, the main protagonist at the beginning is Shift, who's a monkey wearing clothes. An old monkey. It's a lean at Darwinism, a nod in that direction. And he will be the one using the beast and the false prophet, the monk, right? And because then the donkey ends up putting the lion's skin on him and passes him off as Aslan, right? So that this is sort of an end times Lewis engaging with that sort of thinking. Here it's presented even more sinisterly, in a more sinister fashion, because there Tash actually looked like a beast with a beak and was like a material thing. Here, it's not a physical manifestation. And so it's even more terrifying to my mind. It's an invisible enemy who is nonetheless there. And he's been trying to describe that from the beginning of this book. And so he pushes it into the realm of seeing what we can't see. And as I say, he's trying to describe a fourth dimension intruding in upon us, which we don't even recognize normally. And he's trying to bring us to recognize it. So it's a hypothesis which he's making plausible to us. So there are intelligences at stake or involved in the whole process, not just the human intelligence, but supernatural intelligences. Mal-Eldil, God, the Oyarsa, obviously, and the other Eldila, but also, in the case of this, a demon. And it's none other than Satan, in fact. And Satan, not to give away the story because you've already read it, will come to inhabit Weston. But only at the point in which Weston gives himself over to him. He allows himself to be overpowered, overwhelmed, possessed by the devil. And thereafter he gets named this horrifying term, and it actually gives me a sort of a shiver. He calls him the unman, because it's Weston's body. His mouth opens when he speaks, and he looks like he's dead. And in a sense, he is. Spiritually, he's dead. At one point, he lets the old Weston speak, but he only does it to try and persuade him once more. And he cries out, "Help me, Ransom, help me." And out of compassion, he tries to help him, and that's just it's a way of drawing him in to attack him once more. Horrifying. So the idea of demonic possession takes place, and the idea that demons, what it says in Ephesians 6, that our enemies are not flesh and blood, but the spiritual powers, etc. That's what Lewis is describing in Perelandra. Now, this is, as I say, this is a much further step than a critique of atheistic scientism as just bare materialism. It suggests that this idea of materialism and the reductionism that I've already described several times has another layer, and it's a spiritual layer. So when you bring things down to the material, you're bringing them down to where the devil is particularly happy, because he doesn't only love to kill, he likes to destroy. He wants to destroy any sense of good, true, beautiful, any sense of human dignity. So even the doctrine of evolution, which lifts up animals, or the idea that the animal is our brother or our fellow creature and we're a part of the family of animals, Lewis observes in multiple places that it does in no way elevate the dog, it simply denigrates humanity. We don't help the creatures by talking to them as if they were people. We might enjoy it because we love the animal, but the animal does not acquire human capacities at that point. We can't treat it like a human. We can call the dog good or the dog bad, but it has no moral capacities whatsoever, other than what we would recognize as a wonderful human capacity, which is loyalty, affection. It's moved by its affections very strongly, wags its tail when you enter the room. A dog will die for you. Extraordinary. But is not a moral being in the sense that they're capable of evil. And so the flattening effect of reducing human beings to the level of animal just denigrates people. And that's the work of the devil. It's a spiritual attack on human nature, analogous to that which he undertakes when he attacks Christ at the cross. Yes?
Would he also say that is like the doorway to the occult?
It is. And in the same period, the exact same period, a number of practices emerge amongst the intellectual elite: mesmerism, seances, witchcraft, and so forth among the elite, which are very popular. Very popular. Seances with the dead, appealing to the occult through various ritualistic fashions. Yes, it's opening up humanity to demonic assault in a way that they seem protected from if they don't open themselves up. And certainly I would say that Christians are shielded from this by faith, unless they open themselves to it. By not recognizing there's a difference between spirits and the Holy Spirit. There's only one Holy Spirit. There are all manner of spirits, and the spirits of this world are dark, and they will mask themselves as angels of light nonetheless. Therein lies the threat. So in this case, they mask themselves in the form of science, which is regarded as a helpful means of ameliorating, if not improving, the human condition. And that's what he adds to Mary Shelley's dystopian Frankenstein, is the realm of the spiritual powers at work in this. Right? Remember, Shelley doesn't consider that. Lies outside her scope. That's because she's fundamentally atheistic in her viewpoint. She sees the problems of science, yes, but she doesn't see deeply enough. Because there's she is aware there's an evil involved with it, but she mistakes the nature of the evil. And she regards it as effectively superficial in its assault on our nature. It doesn't run there's nothing more malevolent than simply a misguided way of thinking. So if we just think a little differently and are more inclusive and more loving, then this won't happen anymore. Which is basically what you hear in the media all the time. We just need to be kinder to each other, more inclusive, more compassionate, more generous with our material possessions, and the world problems would effectively go away. And there's something to that, because we are beings of material nature who require physical needs. But the Orthodox Christian view will say there's much more involved in this. And so Lewis brings that here literally into the form of a combat. And the venue of the combat is not only Perelandra, or Venus, it's in a garden where a fall has not yet taken place. So that adds a layer. And so now the devil's assault, which took place first in Eden, will now be revisited, but now in the form of a scientist whose own inclinations are leaning towards the demonic, leaning towards it to the point where they are willing to embrace it. And the spirituality, which he notes, of his contemporaries, who have learned their lessons from the stupid materialism of the 19th century, but are adding to it by simply spiritualizing all of our reasoning powers, are actually playing a very dark and dangerous game. Other comments or questions there? Does that make sense? Because that's what's going on here, to my mind. That's exactly what's going on. And for me, this is one of the things which I found plausible about Christianity as a non-Christian. As I told you, I was an adult convert in and around the same time Lewis was, late 20s, is the fact that all of the explanations that were given were insufficient for what I was seeing. And the only thing that could explain it is something far more malevolent and far more insidious that was not even being discussed. But I could see it in myself. The motivations for actions that were, I could rationalize them, but then after the fact say, that was not sufficient for what just happened or what somebody did to me. It wasn't just this person doesn't like me or I didn't like this person. I was motivated by something that I don't even want to admit. In other words, it was sin. Again, science doesn't even recognize the category. They won't use the term. They say that belongs in theology, it doesn't belong here. I think it's the most realistic scientific explanation for something that otherwise falls outside the consideration of the rationalist. So it's a proper rationalism then. Right? Faith and reason, by the way, means that your faith is rational. There isn't a realm of faith and a realm of reasoning. The two coincide. They're not the same thing, but they overlap one another. And they need to be integrated rightly. So what he's doing is objectifying, in physical terms, a non-physical entity. Clear? Do you agree? Am I missing something? Okay, so that's the first point. Stop.